Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Bonjour. So it is an honor and indeed a pleasure to co-host this dinner tonight. We have always been pleased to work with ASPI, as we really believe that ASPI is the only think tank in Australia, bipartisan think tank, with which we can really develop thinking in defense matters. So wonderful think tank, and we have been pleased to collaborate with ASPI for that many years. Having said that, I guess it might be the last time that you'll see EADS and even myself cooperating with ASPI. I want to avoid a heart attack, Peter. Not because we are leaving, but because we might know that EADS will change name next year to become an Airbus group with three divisions instead of 4, which will be Airbus Commercial, Airbus Helicopters, and Airbus Defence and Space. But having said that, changing names, you don't change people. You change organizations, maybe, but you don't change people. And you can make sure that we are committed to Australia, to ASPI, to the Australian Defence Force, to the Army, and to the Air Force, of which the Chief is with us tonight. And I'm very pleased to, again, to introduce AIRMSHL Geoff Brown tonight. Geoff joined the Air Force in February 1980 and became a Deputy Chief of Air Force on June 2008 and Chief of Air Force on 4th of July 2011. I could see that he has logged 5,000 hours in military aircraft, which would be Chinook helicopters, F-18s, C-130s. Shall I say also F-100M on July? Anyhow, I think he has a very eclectic and a very wide experience of flying. So I'm very pleased again to introduce to you AIRMSHL Geoff Brown. Thank you.
Just give me a couple of seconds here. When I'm looking at the slides with Fabrice there, I sort of should have had an MRTT up, other than the next capability that I'm after from government. Anyway, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it really is a great pleasure to be here tonight, and I'd like to sincerely thank Peter Jennings and the members of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute for the invitation and the opportunity to be here tonight. And Fabrice, thank you to EADS for sponsoring tonight. I'd also like to congratulate ASPI on continuing to really be the leading force in the level of national debate on matters that actually shape Australia's security. Now, as a middle power, Australia must be able to shape its security environment. As Chief of Air Force, my job is to balance the structure and posture of the force such that it's fit for government purpose across time. I say across time because the dimensions of the future and the present are really inseparable. Today, we have an Air Force capable of responding to current events and postured to meet future challenges. Now, while the future is impossible to predict, Australia will always seek to assure its decision-making and exercise its strategic preferences. Therefore, the force I deliver must have 2 characteristics. It must be able to adapt to emergent demand and also be strategically adaptable for the longer term. Therefore, the force I deliver must be able to adapt and also be adaptable. It must be able to deliver a reliable force to government on a 24/7 basis. Delivering on government expectations defines a force's relevance. Delivering reliable and relevant air power across time through a professional workforce of character earns respect. So how do I deliver an Air Force that is respected, reliable and relevant? I do this by training and sustaining capabilities that deliver air power across the spectrum of operations up to and including conventional deterrence. The capacity to deter assures Australia's capacity to make its own decisions without undue coercion. As Chief of Air Force, I manage this across time. I manage the present, but I also manage the future. We are a unique First World Air Force that is respected, that is reliable and is relevant. So why do I say unique? No other country in the world has a comparative force that is raised from such a small population with such a huge amount of air, land and sea to cover. But the accomplishments of this force give us a track record that has the respect of government and that of our partners. Our ability to respond rapidly to any task, nationally, regionally, demonstrates that reliability. Our flexibility to adapt to the challenges across the full spectrum of operations demonstrates our relevance to government as a tool of national power. Be assured that Air Force will be as salient tomorrow as it has been over its 92-year history. The current force is more than capable of responding to all non-discretionary tasks. On top of this, I provide government with a set of response options that are scalable. I also set the conditions for the future force able to adapt to discretionary tasks directed by government. To do this, we have to understand the nature of the capabilities. I don't mean by being able to describe the capabilities, though this is important, but we need to understand the strategic relevance of our capabilities. We have to understand that we owe the future a debt that must be paid in the present. So why is this important to all of us? I say this because Australia's way of life, the freedoms we take for granted, and our economic prosperity are intrinsically linked to our national security. The Air Force is out there every single day defending Australia with the most reliable and influential means available to the Government of Australia. Of course, I refer to air power and its integral relationship with other forms of national power. I mentioned that the ability to raise, train and sustain a force is an important part of my job as Chief of Air Force. To raise the force requires us to continually review the skill sets we need in our people. I cannot recruit people that only have the ability to perform today's tasks. I need people with the potential to develop skill sets that we will require in 5 or 10 years' time. Frankly, we cannot stand on the laurels of the excellent team I currently have. We must never lose sight that today's recruits are tomorrow's leaders. The debt we owe to the future is more than just financial. We have an obligation to raise a professional workforce that is adaptable to the evolving character of technology. The current generation of school leavers have a greater propensity to embrace change than those in the past. We must ensure that we can recruit those with potential to excel in both our traditional air power roles and as well as our new age capabilities. That may sound simple, but the marketplace for this group is becoming increasingly competitive. And if I look around this room, I can see my competitors. As Chief, it's my responsibility to provide a work environment that makes Air Force an employer of choice. In an environment where the team outcome is typically measured, I want the workforce to value each member of the team. Individuals need to be able to excel as much as the team. In this area, I actually believe Air Force is making great advances in reshaping our workplace. While we value our heritage, we don't look to the past as a model of how we do business. Air Force is on a journey of adaptation and improvement. We aim to raise and train a workforce that will remain relevant to government expectations and community norms. Education and training assures competitiveness, seeds superiority, and as it does in the larger national system. But Air Force's commitment to excellence in developing our people is another avenue in how we ensure we pay our debt to the future. Now, I realise many in this audience will argue that the corporate world faces similar challenges. However, the consequences of a business not investing in training is the collapse of its market share. In my business, failure to educate and train my force adequately can lead to lapses in national security. Such a failure can lead to a loss of regional or global relevance, reduced prosperity, and in the extreme, loss of sovereignty. This is why Air Force's training requirements are rigorous and reliant on a sound national base. It's why exercises like ACES North, Talisman Sabre, Red Flag and Pitch Black are vital to the sustainment of our current capabilities and the development of our future ones. Education and training underpins our ability to stay responsive and reliable. Many people, even within my service, see sustainment as just the maintenance of current capabilities. It's seen as the logistics behind the aircraft or system or the infrastructure that supports our operations. What I've just described is what I describe as little s sustainment. Operational sustainment is what we do today. Operational sustainment allows us the provision of fuels to enable our aircraft to fly. It's the building, it's the systems behind those operations. It's the maintenance that keeps our aircraft serviceable and on the leading edge of performance. All are critical to our operations today and in the medium term. But it's not this area of sustainment that keeps me up at night. It's the big S, strategic sustainment, that gives me the most pause. It's the area of greatest risk to Air Force's future relevance. The big S sustainment is what Air Force does to ensure we have a force capable of meeting future expectations. Past Chiefs of Air Force have set the conditions for success in the delivery of air power that we witness on a daily basis. My commanding officers and their teams can undertake today's task because of the previous work done on strategic sustainment. The bigger S sustainment is the higher order logistics that allow a force to adapt to and posture for operations as the strategic environment evolves. It's about being a smart customer and a smart operator. Smart sustainment underpins the principle we use in our enterprise decision making. Air Force Headquarters is where our big S sustainment occurs. And I can see JB smiling there at the moment. Sure, we spend a lot of time responding to the crisis of today. We must, otherwise we'd actually be irrelevant to government. But Air Force's Headquarters chief role is to sustain our future and lead the Air Force's development across time. Its true measure of effectiveness is the work undertaken to ensure our people, process and platforms are shaped to meet the challenges of the future. Our future reliability and relevance depends on the actions we take today in the big S sustainment. Now, I've always been a fan of Jack Welch, the former CEO of GE, and he had 6 principles for success, but the one I always liked was control your own destiny, otherwise someone else will. I think it's actually an adaptation of Sun Tzu, who said you should shape the enemy and not let him shape you. It proves the concept of shaping your destiny is really timeless. As a middle power, Australia seeks to shape through influence rather than direct intervention. But we do retain the capacity to intervene if we have to. This is what deterrence is all about. But by preference, Australia seeks or looks to shape our security environment. We seek to assure stability and that of the global commons rather than pursue any notion of an enemy. We look to work with partners who share common goals, and this is what I contend is shaping in a strategic sense. Capabilities inherent in the Air Force today and those we'll raise in the future are the essential elements of strategic shaping. They underpin our ability to act, our ability to adapt, and our ability to respond to current and emerging events. Shaping is not what we just do for our own country, but it's how we support others. Our partners, both regional and global, must know that we're able to respond in meaningful ways if they are in need. We cannot shape the strategic environment from a position of fragility. Our Air Force is not fragile and has proven its ability to respond when called upon. Whether it's in the aftermath of a cyclone in Fiji, an earthquake in Christchurch, or civil unrest in the Solomon Islands, the Air Force has been rapid to respond. Our neighbours know that Australia is reliable, and in every case, the government has relied on the Air Force as the go-to response option. I appreciate we shape the environment through engagement and partnering. However, the capabilities we own today and those in the future are designed for deterrence and, if called upon, employment. As professional airmen, we only employ force as a last resort, but our force structure needs to both be effective and it needs to be seen to be effective. This is actually the hard edge of shaping and really what deterrence is all about. Shaping is about preventing a conflict emerging rather than acting after conflict starts. But when engagement falls short, we need to be in a position to respond. We need to remember, and I think Geoffrey Blaney was the one who termed it, warfare is actually a legitimate human activity. It is the ultimate court of appeal. Our capacity to respond goes to the heart of our reliability and relevance. Without either, there can be no respect. Without respect, there can be no deterrence today or tomorrow. Through effective raise, train and sustain, we have an Air Force capable of operating with decisive force if called upon. Australia needs to ensure that our neighbourhood does not become a source of threat to Australia. The challenge for a middle power such as Australia is to find the right balance between engagement and force posture to achieve these goals. We are very much invested in maintaining a stable global commons. As a First World Air Force, we have also grown, not necessarily in size, but certainly in capability. Our First World Command and Control and air power capabilities, if called upon, have the capacity to take a leading role in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. This has ensured that we remain relevant to our government's ability to sustain its middle power position. Now, I highlighted that engagement is our preferred method of shaping the strategic environment. However, I contend that engagement needs to occur both domestically and internationally. And I actually believe the most effective form of domestic engagement is between the public and private sectors. And here I mean industry. Since Defence adopted a corporate model of service providers such as DMO, there's probably been less direct contact between Air Force Group and industry. However, the Air Force team within the DMO are probably more engaged with industry than any time in our recent history. This relationship underpins the capability Air Force develops from its people, process and platforms. We need to ensure that industry involvement leads to both corporate success and sustainability, but also delivers maximum capability to Air Force. Our ability to engage on the regional stage depends on a secure and sustainable Australian industry. And of course, international engagement has long been a core element of defence policy through a number of iterations of white papers. Indeed, engagement lives more broadly at the heart of our foreign policy. The Prime Minister, in a recent address in Jakarta, reiterated the importance of the development of regional relationships. If we are to maintain successful engagement in our region, we must continue to foster partnerships. We must respect each other and trust each other to keep commitments. And if I was to take one key word out of the PM's speech, it was trust. Trust underpins all elements of engagement, and I'd argue here is where Air Force has excelled. The regional and global air forces we engage implicitly trust our abilities. But trust is not gained overnight. We've developed this trust and respect through our actions in operations and exercises. Respect is earned through long-term engagement in activities such as the 5-Power Defence Arrangements. I think it's little known in the public, but since 1971, Air Force has been engaged with the United Kingdom, New Zealand, Malaysia and Singapore in the security of Malaysia and Singapore. The Integrated Air Defence System is headquartered in Malaysia under the command of an Australian Air Vice Marshal. The relationships we build through engagement underpin our success in operations and exercises. Being able to meet the operational expectations of government when called upon is one of our measures of success. I can raise, train and sustain the Air Force such that it can shape and engage. But unless we're able to operate when tasked, it's really all for show. So what's expected of an Air Force? I'd argue that our task can be broken into two parts, non-discretionary and discretionary. The discretionary tasks are our bread and butter. These are the tasks we are most often called upon to perform. They are the permanent standing tasks that we're undertaking every single day, such as border protection. Right now, there's an Air Force aircraft, probably a P3 Orion, flying patrol along our borders, conducting surveillance on our vast expanse of waters. What most people aren't aware of, however, that there are a lot of other Air Force capabilities supporting this activity. Vigil Air is the core of our air defence surveillance network. It provides enhanced battle space management to support operations such as border protection. To achieve the level of awareness, it takes data feeds from 245 sensors across 45 different systems. In near real time, Vigil Air integrates information from digitally over-the-horizon radars along with tactical platforms like our AEW&C Orions and Hornets. It produces a complete picture of everything airborne in our area of interest. Vigil Air is a 24/7 capability that can support a 24/7 task. In addition to the permanent standing tasks are those non-discretionary operations that occur with little or no warning. Most commonly, they involve humanitarian assistance or disaster response. If we were not able to adequately respond to these, Air Force's relevance to government would rightly be questionable. I'm proud to say that Air Force has a long history of standing up and delivering when called upon. I'd argue that our credentials are pretty solid. We have repeatedly been the government's first respondent in the humanitarian assistance or disaster response options. December 26 marks the 9th anniversary of the tsunami that struck our regional friends in Indonesia and across many parts of Asia. Within 24 hours, Air Force C-130s were en route to Jakarta, loaded with humanitarian aid. The first C-130 landed in Banda Aceh within 48 hours of the waves that devastated the Sumatran community. From Cyclone Tracy in 1974 through to the Bali bombings in 2002 and Cyclone Yasi in 2011, Air Force rubber was the first defence response to hit the ground. On top of these are the counter-terrorism activities we regularly undertake. From Commonwealth Heads of Government meetings through the G20 to APEC, Air Force is ever present. Sometimes it's a noisy presence, but the majority of it goes unseen. And probably that's the way it should be. Through reliability, we gain respect, and from respect, I argue we maintain relevancy. But to be relevant to government, Air Force must be able to respond across the spectrum of operations. My team gains a great deal of personal and professional satisfaction from responding to humanitarian disaster relief and counter-terrorism operations. They're both important for stability and they're strategically salient. However, it's further along the spectrum into stability operations and higher-end warfighting where Air Force exercises its true breadth. The real test for the modern Air Force came in 2003 when we were required to move further across the spectrum into high-end warfighting. The deployment of a squadron of F-18s to the Middle East was a milestone for the modern Air Force. Our really high-end warfighting skills had not been called on since Vietnam. The fundamentals of our raise, train and sustain activities, along with the engagement we'd undertaken with our partners, set us up for success. It certainly had its challenges, but we did pretty seamlessly integrate our fighters into coalition operations. We conducted combat air patrols around Baghdad and strike missions against key Iraqi targets. However, probably one of the more satisfying missions of the war was the close air support performed by the F-18s. During the taking of Al Assad Air Base in Western Iraq, Australian Special Forces came under enemy fire. Australian Hornets on call provided close air support to Australian ground forces in contact. Australian air power integrating with Australian land power. Airmen protecting soldier. Now, I think as Fabrice said, most of you know I'm a pilot, but I am a country lad from southern Queensland. So when I talk about capability, I like to actually use an agricultural analogy. And knowing there's not many farmers in the audience, you'll probably need to bear with me for a little while. I like to describe our capability in 3 terms: bamboo, seed corn and old growth. In times of crisis, we must have the capacity to rapidly grow a capability to meet an urgent requirement. I like to call this bamboo capability. It grows rapidly from an established base and may or may not have longevity. We introduced this type of capability into Afghanistan in the form of the Heron unmanned aerial system. In a very short time, we introduced into service a capability that we had no prior experience with. We achieved this because we grew the capability alongside similar capabilities of our coalition partners. We leveraged off their experience and our existing skills in ISR to go from 0 to a capability in only 6 months. Just like bamboo, we achieved rapid growth from an established base, albeit a base that was not entirely resident in our own force. Bamboo capabilities can only occur with the right conditions. They must be closely monitored to ensure that they add to rather than adversely influence our long-term capabilities. In the Heron, we grew the right capability at the right time for our force. I actually believe it's a capability that will probably find a long-term use in our force structure. The next level of capability forms the basis of our immediate or next generation force. I like to call this the seed corn capabilities because they grow from the skills we maintain today and the requirements we envisage into the future. Seed corn capabilities are those we are transitioning to or are contained in the Defence Capability Plan. Seed corn is what you invest in today to ensure your capabilities fulfil future national security requirements. Now, these capabilities are represented by platforms like Growler, P8, Triton, the Space Surveillance Telescope, and of course, Joint Strike Fighter. They provide a lot of depth in our current force structure. However, their real value will be to future governments. Air Force is growing a new line of capability to assure relevance to the emergent context, and that is a force-level electronic warfare one. In the emergent environment, force-level EW assures theatre and national operations over air, land and sea in peace and in conflict. The confluence of Growler, P8, Wedgetail, Super Hornet, JSF and Navy's Aegis-equipped AWD, as well as Army's Special Force operations, really represents an extraordinary development for Australian security. It assures the relevance in operations across time. And I'm proud that Air Force has a leading role in bringing force-level EW into Australia. Future capability, leveraging off excellence in the present, is the seed that will grow to deliver future air power needs. In that, the final capability I wish to talk about tonight is not material-based. Rather, it is our most valuable capability. That's people. I've always believed that great people will prevail almost in any circumstance and are the tipping point in tight places. Great people are the old growth forest of our organisation. They are the element of capability that takes generations to mature and they can never be given up lightly. I'm not talking about individuals, more about the experience and the breadth and depth of experience we hold in our aircrew, engineers, logisticians, intelligence and even administration. The quality of these people, their character, the breadth and depth of their experience and their capacity to adapt and readapt is the true determinant of the effectiveness of an Air Force. A lot of commentators actually like to compare platform against platform to determine effectiveness. However, capabilities are much more than platforms. The ability to employ a multiple 8-ship formation of fighters in a coordinated strike in a complex electronic warfare environment takes generations to develop. Your Air Force is more than capable of launching such a mission. We are capable because for decades we've been undertaking that raise, train, sustain alongside those shape, engage and operate activities. Respect and reliability and relevance are all bred from experience. However, given the size of our population and economic base, there'll always be a difference between the minimum force to meet every task and the physical reality. The difference between expectations and what we're equipped to do is risk. Of course, risk exists in every enterprise. It's spread across all our fundamental inputs to capability. You know, as I look around the room, I'm confident that each of you deals with some level of risk daily. At the strategic level, risk is held by government. In the private sector, it's held by the CEO or Chief Operating Officer. Understanding the consequences of risk being realised is critical in developing our force. It's essential that decision makers appreciate the strategic limitations of each of our capabilities. Now, I'm not going to expand on those limitations tonight, but they all contribute to the degree of risk that's carried. However, in almost all cases, we strive to mitigate the risk to the maximum possible extent. National security level risk can best be described as the delta between the capabilities we need and the capabilities we have. And to some extent, we offset risk by the relationships established through industry contacts, domestic and international partners, and our foreign policies. In this regard, in regard to our weapons systems, we must seek to remain as close to the leading edge of technology as we can. This approach reduces the level of risk to our present as well as our future. We need to remember that the future of tomorrow is our sons and daughters' present. The capabilities we acquire must be relevant to the range of potential missions we will be expected to perform. Operational missions could involve any of our 4 core capabilities: air mobility, ISR, strike or control of the air. However, the real strategic value of a weapons system, their value to government, is not their actual employment, but their combat potential. A classic example of this is the F-111. Acquired in the 1970s, it was never used in anger by any Australian government. A short-sighted argument could be made, because it was never employed operationally, it was a waste of taxpayers' money. But that is far from reality. From a more strategic perspective, it made a significant contribution to our national security interests because of its incredible strike potential. The value of deterrence should never be underrated. The value is at the heart of our position as a middle power. A middle power seeks stability through influence rather than action. A middle power must have the ability to influence, be it diplomatically, economically or militarily. Ideally, it's a balance of each. Many of our response options have been developed around our approach to engagement. For more than 60 years, the cornerstone of our engagement has been based around the ANZUS alliance. Alliances can actually determine the level of capability an Air Force can deliver. Our partnership with the US has allowed us to punch well above countries of similar size and economy to us. As reliable and respected allies, we have access to technology, systems and expertise that we really have integrated into many of our capabilities. Alliances and partnerships allow risk to be mitigated so that all parties can carry reduced capabilities across some aspects of their force. The IADS of the 5-party defence arrangement I mentioned earlier is probably a great example. No one country in that relationship can provide the level of security we cooperatively can deliver. Our Classic and Super Hornets, P3s, C-130s and AEW&C all regularly contribute to that stability. Australia does not have the capacity to maintain regional stability all on our own. No middle power has. This is why Air Force will continue to value our alliances and partnerships. It's why the Prime Minister recently stated that we must continue to develop relationships with neighbours such as Indonesia as a matter of urgency. My final point on the relevance of Air Force is in the conduct of discretionary operations. Discretionary tasks are those that the government chooses to engage in. The measure of a force is its adaptability to adapt its capabilities to support unforeseen operations. This adaptation can be a change of character of the mission. We demonstrated the ability to switch our P3 Orions to overland ISR in Iraq and Afghanistan. Normally a maritime asset, we were able to provide real-time imagery feeds to Australian and coalition troops on the ground. This was a mission not practiced before the Middle East, but the thirst for ISR remained so insatiable that the mission quickly evolved into a core task. In each of the cases I've discussed tonight, Air Force has proved its relevance to both our operational forces and government. We have programs across the Defence Capability Plan to transition our force so we remain relevant to future governments. Our relevance will ensure that we continue to undertake all essential activities I've described earlier. Each function comes with its challenges, but also its opportunities. As Chief of Air Force, it's my challenge to sustain the current capabilities to meet today's responsibilities. Equally, I must set the conditions for a force to meet future expectations. My challenge is to balance the resources needed to sustain the current force with the resources needed to manage the future force requirements. It creates a natural tension between the operational and strategic levels. But I see my greatest challenge as Chief is to ensure the future will be served by capabilities that remain relevant. I want to ensure that the debt we owe to the future is actually paid today. The team we recruit, the training programs we have in place, the little s and the big S sustainment programs will all contribute to paying our debt. Our activities to raise, train and sustain the current force and the policies that shape our environment alongside engagement with our allies and regional partners all provide the basis for our future support to government needs. These are the currency that will service our debt and ensure the Air Force remains respected, reliable and relevant well into the future. Thank you. I was really aiming to run Peter out of question time.
You haven't succeeded, Geoff. Thank you. That was a splendid presentation. I'm just advancing from a different direction now. So, ladies and gentlemen, we do have time for a number of questions, probably about 5 minutes or so, and then the main course will due to be served. I thought I'd exercise the moderator's right to start, Geoff, not with the cheeky question that I told you I was going to ask. I'll come to that one later if there's time. But I just wanted to reflect on the deterrence idea that you advanced in terms of conventional capability. And I guess my question for you is, long term, how credible is it for Australia to do that when we find ourselves in a region where inevitably the countries around us are growing much faster and will become much larger than us. So I think that, in the early 1980s, our defence expenditure matched the defence expenditure of all of the ASEAN countries, whereas now it's really just the inner core four ASEANs which match where Australia is at, and the growth projections are pretty obvious. Does your deterrence picture sort of work in that environment if you think 20 years ahead?
I think in 20 years we're in an evolving environment. Yeah, fundamentally, the government gets the defence force it's prepared to pay for. We invest probably about 8 or 9% of government expenditure on defence. There's other nations in the region that invest 25 to 30% of government expenditure in defence. But I think the key of what I was talking about was partnering in the region. Yeah, at the moment, well, in fact, 2 nights ago I had dinner with the chief of the Singaporean Air Force. In about 4 weeks' time, I'm up in Indonesia with Peter, who's chief of the Indonesian Air Force. If you look at our last pitch black exercise, we had Thais, we had Singaporeans, we had Indonesians as well as Americans and ourselves, all working together on the same game plan to achieve what I'd argue is a regional outcome. I think certainly their abilities will grow. Whether we can match them or not, I don't think is as critical as the fact that we need to make a valued contribution to that regional effort.
Thanks, Geoff. Well, we do have some time for questions, ladies and gentlemen. Can I ask you to wait for the roving mic and identify yourself first? Brendan Nicholson.
Hello, AIRMSHL. Brendan Nicholson from the Australian. It's been noted that in your last address to ASPI, you talked at some length about the need for 100 joint strike fighters. You probably, like many journalists, suffer under the weight of critical emails about the JSF program in your computer inbox. Could you give us an update on how the project's going, whether it's struggling as some people claim it is, and whether it's going to produce an aircraft as you anticipated?
Brendan, if I was to be brutally honest, I worry less about the JSF than even some of the in-service capabilities that we've got. Because some of the in-service capabilities I've got, I'm actually the lead customer for. But with Joint Strike Fighter, I've got the US Marines, I've got the US Air Force, I've got the Royal Air Force, and I've got the US Marines in front of me blazing a trail. If those very competent organisations can't solve any issues with the Joint Strike Fighter, then the Western world is in a lot of trouble. Just to go on further, I track the progress pretty closely. If anything, most aspects of the Joint Strike Fighter are getting a lot better with time, and I'm pretty confident of the sort of capability that we'll get. You certainly get analysts from the Air Power Institute and places like that talk about one-on-one fights and turning ability and speed. I just go back in 100 years of air combat, 75% of the kills have been unseen. With the Joint Strike Fighter, we actually maintain that ability to take those unseen kills, and that's, to me, particularly important.
And Mr. Barker.
Could you tell us for how much longer frontline fighter aircraft will continue to have pilots in them? You've spoken very much about the advancement of drone technology. How much longer will you need combat pilots in aircraft?
Yeah, look, it's a good question. I think UAVs, and those of you've heard me talk at the Williams Foundation know that I'll never use the word drone unless under duress. But UAVs are great for long endurance, long distances, and the dull and dirty missions. But like all capabilities, they do have vulnerabilities. And the vulnerability of UAVs is actually in the communication systems to the UAV. So I think we'll probably have manned fighters in some form or other for quite a while until we can actually fully make our communication systems invulnerable. I actually see a hybrid environment going forward, if I was to be absolutely truthful. I think there's a place for manned fighters and probably unmanned wingmen. And I think that's probably the first step we'll take. But I think we'll probably have manned fighters for another 30 or 40 years. I've had a look at all the latest technology in UAVs, including the XB-47. They are a long way from a capability to replace a JSF.
And John Blaxland, it's an inspired table at the back there.
AIRMSHL, it's John Blaxland from the ANU. You would have been across the issue of the debate about whether or not the defence bureaucracy, both uniformed and civilian, is top-heavy. Some people are saying that compared to the peak of the Second World War, we've got more chiefs than we've got Indians by a long shot. I wonder if you've got any comments to make about that.
Yeah, look, I'll make a comment. I have a lot of great colleagues that sit around the DC table with me. They have exceptional people as well. But in 1997, when we restructured the Defence Department, we probably created a lot of centralised organisations. If you do a Management 101, one of the things that happens with centralised organisations is, by their very nature, they grow management overhead. If we're going to decrease the amount of management overhead we've got to have a look at the fundamental structure of the Defence Department.
There's a good answer. Now, I think we've got time for maybe one more question. Yes, please, middle table here.
You're smiling, Brendan, at that answer.
Hi, I'm Georgie Skipper from the Foreign Minister's Office. Recently, the Indonesian Foreign Minister made a comment that the region, the Indo-Pacific region, faced a case of dynamic equilibrium in the sense that we were going to see a lot of tension, but not necessarily anything that came to a major blow-up in terms of our military. How does that affect our partnership and alliances that you discussed in relation to the US and what we get from our partnership and alliances closer in the region in the Indo-Pacific?
For sure. I think, and if I was to go back to my speech 12 months ago where I talked about what we've really got a defence force for, you know, a lot of people talk about defending Australia from attack, but the elements are that we've got an economy, $1 trillion economy, half of its imports and exports. If anything goes wrong in the global commons, we've got an interest in it. I'd argue that a lot of our neighbours are in the same place. And we're just in a situation where we've got a couple of rising powers, some dominant powers that have been there for 60 years. There's change afoot. It needs to be managed carefully. All the evidence I've got says that there is a lot of people working hard to make sure that the rise of China is a peaceful rise. But like anything, you always need insurance against those things. And I think if you look at my Southeast Asian brethren, that's why they all turn up at pitch black. We need to be able to work together and work well together, and that's our aim, just in case.
Well, Geoff, thank you very much. I think that's been a really fascinating presentation. Like a few people did, I looked at your speech from 12 or a few months or more months ago, and I'm struck by a couple of things that sort of contrast between where we were then and where we are now. One, I think a much deeper sense of Australian commitment emerging to the idea of engagement with the region. And I've noticed also from your colleagues as well in terms of speeches that I've heard from Chief of Navy and Chief of Army recently, quite an emphasis on the need to build trust, which implies, I think, taking sort of extra steps to create those linkages into the region. I also very struck by your emphasis on the need for investment in education and training as being a sort of a vital future enabling capability for the Air Force. And then finally, I think also the very, in some ways, challenging combination of engagement at the same time as credible conventional deterrence is the basis of Air Force future planning. So for me, it's been, I think, a particularly interesting speech. I thank you for the time that you've taken to put it together and also to come in and speak to us this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, could you please thank the Chief of Air Force.
Thank you,